The hardest thing about losing everything isn't the money. It's watching people look at you as if you never mattered. Sometimes, the people standing quietly in the background are carrying stories no one can imagine. 10 years after his father lost his business, Ethan Walker stood in the snow outside a luxury resort, while a billionaire treated him like he was invisible. In front of hundreds of guests, the wealthy businessman believed he was putting a nobody in his place. What he didn't realize was that this quiet snow shoveler had spent years carrying a promise. And before the week was over, both of their lives would be changed forever. Before we start, let us know your city in the comments. And subscribe if you believe every person deserves to be treated with respect. Fresh snow had fallen across the Colorado mountains during the night, covering the roads, rooftops, and pine trees in a blanket of white. Warm lights glowed behind tall windows. Luxury vehicles rolled through the gates, and workers hurried through the cold preparing for what many people were already calling the social event of the year. Near the front entrance, Ethan Walker pushed a heavy shovel through a thick layer of packed snow. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wore an old navy jacket faded by years of use, a wool cap pulled low over dark brown hair, and work boots stained by salt and ice. At 32, he was tall and broad, shouldered, with a short beard and calm gray eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking. Most people assumed he was just another laborer trying to earn a paycheck. Ethan had learned long ago that people usually saw exactly what they expected to see. The engagement party for the daughter of billionaire Richard Holloway was scheduled to begin that evening. Politicians, investors, celebrities, and business leaders from across the country were expected to attend. The entire resort had been transformed for the occasion. Imported flowers lined the hallways. Crystal chandeliers had been polished until they sparkled. Every detail had been inspected and re-inspected. Yet despite all the luxury surrounding him, Ethan focused only on the path in front of him, carefully clearing the last traces of ice from the stone walkway. Walker. The sharp voice belonged to Kyle Morgan, the resort's operations manager. Kyle was a stocky man in his early 40s with thinning blonde hair, and a face that always seemed one bad day away from turning completely red. Years of dealing with demanding wealthy guests had made him impatient, and he often treated employees as if they were obstacles instead of people. "You've been on this section for nearly half an hour," Kyle said. "Do you plan on finishing before spring?" A few nearby workers laughed nervously. Ethan looked up. "The ice underneath is thicker than it looks." Kyle folded his arms. "The guests don't care about ice. They care about appearances." Ethan nodded once. "It'll be finished." The response somehow irritated Kyle more than an argument would have. After a moment, he muttered something under his breath and walked away. Ethan returned to work, though his thoughts had drifted elsewhere. Inside the inner pocket of his jacket was a small leather notebook. The cover was cracked, and the pages were worn from being opened countless times. It had belonged to his father. Whenever life became complicated, Ethan carried it with him. Not because he needed to read it anymore, but because it reminded him of promises he had never forgotten. By late afternoon, the first wave of important guests began arriving. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway. Security teams took positions near every entrance. Photographers gathered near the ballroom doors. The atmosphere changed from busy to tense, the way it always did when powerful people prepared to impress one another. Then Richard Holloway arrived. Even before stepping from his vehicle, he drew attention. At 60 years old, Richard carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most important person in every room. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His expensive overcoat fit him flawlessly, and people seemed to straighten their posture the moment he appeared. Wealth had become part of his identity, so had control. Richard exchanged greetings with several guests before his eyes settled on Ethan. The smile disappeared from his face. "Why is he still here?" he asked. The question was directed at nobody and everybody at the same time. Kyle rushed forward immediately. "Sir, he's finishing the entrance path." Richard studied Ethan for several seconds. His gaze moved from the worn boots to the old jacket, and finally to the shovel in his hands. Something about Ethan's presence seemed to offend him. "I don't want maintenance staff standing around the entrance when my guests arrive." The area grew quiet. Several nearby guests paused to watch. Ethan remained calm. "I'm almost finished." Richard took a step closer. "You don't seem to understand. Tonight is important." Ethan met his eyes. "I understand." The answer wasn't disrespectful, it wasn't rude, but it wasn't submissive either. Richard's expression hardened. People like him were accustomed to immediate obedience. "Security," he said. "Remove him." Two guards approached at once. One placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. A few guests exchanged amused smiles. Others pretended not to notice. Nobody spoke up. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something familiar settle in his chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, something older. The memory of watching people remain silent while someone else decided who mattered and who didn't. He could have argued. He could have resisted. Instead, he quietly set down the shovel and allowed the guards to escort him away. Behind him, the conversations resumed almost immediately. The music continued. The party moved forward, as if he had never been there at all. Outside, the temperature had dropped sharply. Snow drifted through the darkness while laughter spilled from the ballroom windows. Ethan stood alone near the edge of the property and looked back at the glowing building. Hundreds of people were inside. Wealthy people, influential people, people who believed they understood power. His phone vibrated. At first he ignored it. Then it vibrated again. The message came from a secure number. Ethan opened it. The moment he read the words, the color drained from his face. "We found Emily." For several seconds he simply stared at the screen. Emily was his younger sister, a 20-year-old medical student with bright green eyes and an endless ability to believe the best in people. 3 days earlier she had vanished without explanation. No phone calls, no messages, no trace. A second notification appeared. It contained only a location pin. Nothing else. No explanation. Just a place. The cold winter air suddenly felt much heavier. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the brightly lit ballroom where Richard Holloway and his guests continued celebrating. Something deep inside him whispered that this night had just changed, and whatever happened next would be far bigger than a simple engagement party. The drive from Silver Pine Resort to the outskirts of Denver should have taken less than 3 hours. That night it took nearly 5. Snow continued falling across the interstate, and strong winds pushed curtains of white across the highway. Visibility came and went without warning. Most drivers had already given up and pulled into roadside motels. Ethan Walker kept going. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but his mind refused to rest. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the location pin glowing on his phone screen. Emily had been missing for 3 days. 3 days of unanswered questions. 3 days of imagining every terrible possibility a brother could imagine. He had spent years protecting her from the burdens he carried. Now he feared those burdens had finally found her. Around midnight, Ethan turned onto a narrow industrial road buried beneath fresh snow. The area had once housed warehouses and distribution centers, but most of the buildings had been abandoned years ago. Rusted fences leaned sideways. Broken security lights flickered in the darkness. The location pin led him to a large warehouse standing alone at the end of the road. Only one light was visible inside. Ethan parked 100 yards away and stepped into the cold. The wind immediately cut through his jacket. He studied the building carefully. 2 black SUVs sat near the entrance. Tire tracks were fresh. Someone was still here. As he approached, the warehouse door slowly opened. A woman stepped outside. For a moment, Ethan froze. Emily, his younger sister, rushed toward him. Emily Walker was 20 years old, slender and athletic, from years of hiking and outdoor sports. Her dark blonde hair was tied into a messy ponytail. And despite her exhaustion, her green eyes still carried the same warmth she had possessed since childhood. Their mother used to say Emily had inherited all the kindness in the family. Ethan had always believed that was true. She threw her arms around him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The relief was almost painful. Then Ethan noticed something. Emily wasn't injured, she wasn't tied up, and she wasn't afraid. Not in the way someone rescued from captivity should be. Before he could ask questions, a voice echoed from inside the warehouse. "I was wondering how long it would take you." A tall man emerged from the shadows. Victor Kane looked to be in his late 40s. He had sharp features, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, and cold blue eyes that seemed to measure everything around him. A faint scar crossed the side of his jaw, a souvenir from his years serving in military special operations before entering the private security world. People who worked for Victor respected him. People who worked against him usually feared him. Victor stopped a few yards away. Emily stepped back beside her brother. "You can relax," Victor said. "Nobody has hurt her." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Then why is she here?" Victor smiled slightly. "You've done an impressive job hiding." Ethan said nothing. "Most people know you as a seasonal worker, a contractor, a man who moves from place to place. That's a very convincing story." Victor tilted his head. "But stories aren't always true." Emily looked between them. "What is he talking about?" Ethan ignored the question. "What do you want?" Victor's expression became serious. "We know who you are." The words hung in the cold air. For the first time that night, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not fear, concern. Because very few people were supposed to know the truth, Victor continued. "Not everything, but enough. Enough to know you didn't take a snow-shoveling job because you needed money. Enough to know your appearance at Silver Pine Resort wasn't an accident." Emily stared at her brother. Confusion filled her face. "Ethan." He looked at her but didn't answer. Victor folded his hands behind his back. "Richard Holloway has been aware of you for months." That caught Ethan's attention. Months. Not days. Not weeks. Months. Victor nodded as if he could read the reaction. "We've been watching each other for a long time. You know that now." The warehouse suddenly felt smaller. The game Ethan believed he was controlling appeared far more complicated than he had realized. Emily moved closer to him. "Can somebody tell me what's happening?" Before either man could answer, Victor reached into his coat pocket and removed a small envelope. He handed it to Ethan. Inside was a single photograph. Ethan stared at it. His heartbeat slowed. The photograph showed him entering Silver Pine Resort 6 months earlier under a different name. Someone had been watching long before he arrived for the engagement party. Victor's voice softened. "Richard wants to meet you." Ethan lifted his eyes. "And if I refuse?" Victor glanced toward the 2 black SUVs. "You won't." The wind howled through the broken warehouse windows. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Ethan carefully folded the photograph and placed it inside his jacket. He looked at Emily, then back at Victor, and for the first time since arriving, he understood one thing clearly. This wasn't a rescue. It was an invitation. By the time Ethan Walker returned to Silver Pine Resort, the storm had begun to ease. Snow still drifted across the mountains, but the fierce winds that had battered Colorado through the night were finally losing strength. The resort looked peaceful from a distance, though Ethan knew appearances could be deceiving. Some of the most important moments in life happened behind closed doors where nobody could see them. Victor Kane escorted Ethan and Emily through a private entrance far from the ballroom. Most of the guests were either asleep in their luxury suites or recovering from a night of celebration. The laughter and music that had filled the resort only hours earlier had faded into silence. Victor led them down a quiet hallway and stopped outside a conference room overlooking the valley. Inside, Richard Holloway was waiting. The billionaire stood near a wall of windows, watching snow settle over the pine trees below. In daylight, he appeared less intimidating than he had the previous evening, though he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades building an empire. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture straight, and his expensive suit looked as flawless as ever. Yet there was something different in his eyes now. The certainty Ethan had seen the night before seemed slightly diminished. Richard turned when the door opened. His gaze settled on Ethan immediately. For several moments neither man spoke. Emily remained beside her brother, quietly observing. She had spent most of her life hearing very little about their father's business career. Now she sensed she was standing in the middle of a story that had begun long before she was old enough to understand it. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "You look more like him than I remembered." Ethan didn't need to ask who he meant. Their father had been gone for over a decade, but there were still moments when Ethan caught his own reflection and saw traces of the man who had raised him. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same habit of remaining silent when emotions ran deepest. Richard slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. "Your father and I spent years in rooms like this. Back then, Neither of us had what we have today. We were both chasing opportunities. We were both trying to build something. You built an empire, Ethan replied. He lost everything. Richard studied him carefully before answering. That's one way to describe it. The response irritated Ethan more than he expected. For years he had imagined confronting the man responsible for so much pain. He had pictured anger, denial, excuses. Instead, Richard spoke with the detached calm of someone discussing events from another lifetime. The billionaire folded his hands on the table. Your father was talented, smarter than most people gave him credit for, but business isn't always fair. Sometimes the stronger company survives, sometimes it doesn't. Emily's expression hardened. You make it sound like a natural disaster. Richard looked at her. No, it was a business deal. The simplicity of the answer hung heavily in the room. For Ethan, old memories resurfaced immediately. He remembered the late nights when his father sat alone in the kitchen reviewing documents, long after everyone else had gone to bed. He remembered watching confidence slowly disappear from a man who had once believed hard work could solve almost anything. Most of all, he remembered the silence that followed. The silence after the lawsuits. The silence after investors disappeared. The silence after hope finally ran out. Richard eventually leaned back in his chair. I know what you think of me, and honestly, I understand it. If our positions were reversed, I might feel the same way. Then you know why I'm here, Ethan said. Richard nodded. Of course I do. For the first time, a faint smile appeared on his face. You spent years preparing for this moment. Every move you've made points to the same thing. You want revenge. Emily glanced toward her brother. Victor remained silent near the door. Richard continued. You watched your father lose everything. And now you want me to experience the same thing. That's human nature. Most people would do exactly what you're doing. Ethan looked toward the snow, covered mountains beyond the glass. For a moment he thought about all the years that had passed. The sacrifices, the long nights, the opportunities he had ignored. If revenge had been his goal, there had been easier ways to pursue it. When he finally turned back, his voice remained calm. No. The word caught Richard off guard. The billionaire frowned slightly. No. If revenge was all I wanted, Ethan said, I wouldn't have spent 10 years building toward this. For the first time since the conversation began, uncertainty entered Richard Holloway's expression. He had expected anger. He had expected resentment. He had even expected hatred. What he had not expected was confidence. Ethan could see the realization slowly forming behind the older man's eyes. Richard had spent months studying him, tracking him, and trying to understand his motives. Yet somehow he had reached the wrong conclusion. Because revenge was small, what Ethan had planned was something much bigger. And Richard was only beginning to realize it. By evening, Silver Pine Resort had returned to life. The storm that had dominated the previous day was fading into memory, replaced by clear skies and a sharp winter cold that made the mountain air feel almost crystal. Like guests who had delayed their departures remained on the property. And Richard Holloway had decided to move forward with the most important business meeting of his career. The ballroom looked even more impressive than it had the night before. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the fireplace. Conversations filled the room as investors and executives from around the world gathered around small tables covered in white linen. To most people, it looked like a celebration. To Ethan Walker, it looked like a countdown. Richard moved through the ballroom with renewed confidence. The uncertainty Ethan had seen earlier seemed to have disappeared. Whatever concerns had surfaced during their private conversation, Richard clearly believed he remained in control. Wealth had taught him an important lesson over the years. Most problems could be solved with enough influence, enough lawyers, or enough money. Tonight, he expected all three to work in his favor. Emily sat quietly near the back of the room, watching events unfold. She still understood only fragments of what was happening, but she had begun to notice something strange. Ethan appeared unusually calm. Not the calm of a man hoping for a favorable outcome. The calm of a man who already knew the outcome. At precisely 7 o'clock, Richard stepped onto a small stage prepared near the center of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising a glass, "thank you for joining us for what I believe will be a historic evening." Applause followed. Richard smiled. "For years, I have worked toward expanding Holloway Group into new markets. Tonight, that vision becomes reality." He motioned toward a table where several legal documents waited. Beside them stood a distinguished-looking attorney named Martin Graves. Graves was a thin man in his 60s with silver-rimmed glasses and neatly combed white hair. He had spent 40 years handling corporate transactions and was known throughout financial circles for his precision and discretion. If Martin Graves was present, the deal was serious. Richard signed the first document, then the second, then the final signature page. The room erupted into applause once again. Several investors rose from their seats. Champagne glasses were lifted. Richard Holloway looked victorious. For a few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as he expected. Then the first phone rang. The sound barely attracted attention. One executive glanced at his screen and frowned. A moment later, another phone rang, then another. Within 60 seconds, at least a dozen people around the ballroom were checking messages. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Conversations became whispers. Whispers became concerned discussions. Richard noticed it too. His smile faded. Martin Graves stepped away from the signing table and looked down at his phone. The color drained from his face. Richard approached him. "What is it?" Graves hesitated. "Several regulatory filings were just challenged." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means lawyers are involved." A second attorney hurried across the room. Then a third. More phones continued ringing. The celebration was rapidly turning into confusion. Richard grabbed one of the reports being passed between advisors. His eyes moved across the page. Several subsidiary companies had suddenly become the subject of legal review. Accounts were being temporarily frozen pending investigation. Ownership structures were being challenged. Richard looked up. "This is impossible." Across the ballroom, Ethan remained seated. He neither smiled nor reacted. That bothered Richard more than anything else. Because while everyone else appeared shocked, Ethan appeared prepared. Then the ballroom doors opened. 3 people entered together. Leading them was a woman Richard had never met. Sophia Reed walked with quiet confidence. She was in her late 30s, tall and composed, with dark brown hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders, and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed very little. Years as a corporate attorney had taught her to remain calm under pressure. Those who worked with her often described her as polite but relentless. 2 additional attorneys followed behind her carrying briefcases. The room gradually fell silent. Sophia walked directly toward Ethan. Richard watched every step. So did everyone else. When she reached him, she stopped and offered a respectful nod. "Good evening, sir." The word seemed to echo through the ballroom. "Sir." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily looked down briefly and smiled to herself. Richard stared at Ethan as though seeing him for the first time. Sophia handed Ethan. "The filings have been completed," she said. "Every document was accepted within the last hour." Ethan opened the folder and reviewed several pages. "Any complications?" "None," Sophia replied. "Everything occurred exactly on schedule." Richard felt a cold sensation settle in his stomach. For the first time all evening, genuine concern appeared in his eyes. Because suddenly, he realized that the most important people in the room were no longer standing beside him. They were standing beside Ethan, and whatever had just begun, it had been planned long before anyone gathered in this ballroom. The ballroom remained silent, long after Sophia Reed addressed Ethan as Sir. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. Others stared openly at Ethan, trying to reconcile the image in front of them with the man they had watched clearing snow outside. Less than 2 days earlier, Richard Holloway stood motionless near the signing table, his attention fixed entirely on Ethan. For perhaps the first time in decades, Richard found himself in a room where he no longer understood what was happening. Sophia calmly placed several documents on the table before him. "I believe you'll want to read these," she said. Richard took the folder and opened it. At first, his expression remained unchanged, Then his eyes narrowed. A moment later, the color slowly drained from his face. The room waited. No one spoke. Richard turned another page, then another. His hands, once steady enough to negotiate billion-dollar transactions without hesitation, suddenly seemed less certain. Finally, he looked up. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The question carried none of the arrogance people had grown accustomed to hearing from him. Ethan rose from his chair. For years he had imagined this moment. Surprisingly, he felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a strange sense of completion. "My name is Ethan Walker," he said. "And 10 years ago, after my father lost everything, I made a decision." Richard continued staring at him. Sophia opened another folder and handed it to Martin Graves. The older attorney adjusted his glasses and reviewed the contents. As he read, his eyes widened. "Good Lord," he whispered. Several guests leaned forward. Martin slowly looked toward Richard, the parent company involved in tonight's transaction. He paused. "Richard, it's not owned by foreign investors." The room became still again. "Then who owns it?" Richard asked. Martin swallowed. "He does." The attorney pointed directly at Ethan. A murmur spread throughout the ballroom. Sophia stepped forward. "North Star Global Holdings currently manages assets across multiple countries and controls investments valued in excess of $40 billion. Mr. Walker founded the company 11 years ago." Several champagne glasses were quietly lowered. One investor nearly dropped his phone. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Even though she had suspected her brother was hiding something, she had never imagined the scale of it. Richard looked as though someone had removed the floor beneath him. "No." The word escaped almost automatically. Sophia slid the final document across the table. "You personally approved every signature tonight. The transaction is fully legal, fully enforceable, and already registered." Richard grabbed the paperwork. His eyes moved desperately across each page. Every line led to the same conclusion. Every signature pointed to the same outcome. The acquisition he believed would expand his empire had instead transferred control of its most valuable holdings into a structure controlled by Ethan Walker. The realization hit him all at once. 10 years. 10 years of planning. 10 years of patience. 10 years of waiting for the right moment. Richard lowered himself into a chair. The powerful billionaire, who had commanded every room he entered, suddenly looked like an old man carrying a weight he could no longer support. Around him, investors began quietly stepping away. Some checked their phones. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Business relationships built over decades were evaporating in real time. Richard finally lifted his eyes toward Ethan. "All this time," he said softly. "The snow, shoveling job, the resort, everything." Ethan nodded. "Everything. Why?" The question surprised many people in the room. Because of how it was asked. There was no anger left in Richard's voice. Only confusion. Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "When my father lost his company, people watched it happen. Lawyers watched, investors watched, business partners watched. Most of them knew what was happening wasn't right." His gaze moved slowly across the ballroom. But nobody said anything. The room remained silent. They looked away because it was easier. Richard lowered his head. Ethan continued. "I didn't build North Star to destroy you. I built it because my father deserved proof that what happened to him didn't define the rest of our lives." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Outside, snow began falling again beyond the ballroom windows. Soft, quiet, almost peaceful. Emily walked across the room and stood beside her brother. She slipped her arm through his and rested her head briefly against his shoulder. The gesture reminded Ethan of simpler years before lawsuits, investigations, and promises made beside hospital beds. Without another word, he turned toward the exit. Guests stepped aside as he passed. No one stopped him. No one challenged him. The same people who had barely noticed him when he carried a snow shovel now watched him with stunned respect. Near the doorway, Ethan paused one final time and looked back. Richard remained seated at the table surrounded by documents. The empire he had spent decades building was no longer the empire he thought it was. Then Ethan opened the door and stepped outside with Emily. The cold mountain air greeted them immediately. Snowflakes drifted through the darkness, settling quietly across the resort grounds. Together they walked toward the waiting car, leaving behind the lights, the contracts, and the past. For the first time in 10 years, Ethan felt something he had almost forgotten: peace.